I'm one with Angela Rye, and I get to sit with Senate candidate, United States Senate candidate from Georgia, Reverend Raphael Warnock. Thank you so much for making time. I know we tried to do this on the bus the other day, but it was like, it wasn't happening. So thank you for doing this in person.
Great to be here with you. I was rolling across rural Georgia. And as is the case in a lot of states, broadband is in and out. That's part of the infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt in this country.
How have you been received in the field? How is your, going around Georgia? What have you learned? What have you seen? Talk to us about your experience thus far on the last day of early voting, I might add.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here and for your amazing group of followers. I'm Raphael Warnock. I'm running for the United States Senate. And here in the state of Georgia, I'm someone who grew up in this state, one of 12 children in my family. I'm number 11, the first college graduate. I'm running because I understand the struggles of ordinary people. And as I'm moving across this state, people are very concerned about their lives and their ability just to thrive. We have 500,000 people in the Medicaid gap here in Georgia, 1.8 million Georgians with pre-existing conditions. If my opponent, the unelected, selected Senator of Georgia, Kelly Loeffler, if she's able to stay there, or if Doug Collins, the Republican congressman who's challenging her, if he gets the seat, they think it's a good idea to get rid of the Affordable Care Act in the middle of a global pandemic. So that would leave 1.8 million Georgians who have pre-existing conditions uncovered, not to mention the folks that we have in the Medicaid gap in this state. We're one of only 12 states that is yet to expand Medicaid. And so Georgia needs a senator who understands that health care is a human right, and that it is certainly something that the richest nation in the world can and ought to provide to all of its citizens. So people are concerned about their health care as we're dealing with this global pandemic that's created an economic turn down, the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression. Ordinary people are struggling, and while politicians are playing games, we haven't seen any COVID relief in months. And people are facing unemployment, evictions, not to mention the loss of loved ones.
You bring up several, I think, very salient points around healthcare and morality, and I think another strong example of morality, or the lack thereof, is around our voting rights and our voter protections. Can you talk about, just for a moment, laying partisanship aside, the spiritual call you feel to address some of these issues, given your role as a pastor of one of the most historic churches, not just in Atlanta, but to Black America. Talk about the intersection of your faith and what it means to address these issues from a moral standpoint.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I absolutely feel called to this, and this is why I'm doing it. To run for office is a heck of a thing to decide to do for yourself or to yourself and the folks who love you. But I think there's so much at stake. And I've been at Ebenezer Baptist Church 15 years, and I'm blessed to serve as pastor of that congregation that recalls, of course, the name of Martin Luther King Jr. So for us, voting is not just a civic duty, it's a sacred obligation and responsibility. Because when you think about it, your vote is really your voice. And voice is about human dignity, this basic idea that all of us are children of God. And so when people will engage in voter suppression, they are violating this idea that everybody is a treasure, that everybody is a gift, and everybody ought to have a voice. I think democracy, for all of its challenges, is the political expression of that theological idea, that all of God's children have value and they ought to have a voice. And so that's why I work so hard around voting rights. Stacey Abrams and I have been working together for years. When she started the New Georgia Project, she came to me and said, hey, I'm about to get into some good trouble. John Lewis is a member of my congregation, and I was deeply honored to officiate his service. And so, she knows I'm always down for a good fight. And later I became the chair of the board. We registered 400,000 new voters in the state. And so when you see Georgia changing, it's not magic, it's hard work. Over about a decade, we've been working at this. And again, as you point out, all of this comes from my faith. It is the faith that was shaped by an enslaved people in the brush arbors of Georgia, and Mississippi, and Alabama, after the official church meeting was over. When they were told, slaves, obey your masters, they had another church meeting where they preached a whole different kind of gospel. It was the gospel of liberation. And so Martin Luther King Jr. himself, he doesn't spring out of nowhere, ex nihilo, out of nothing. He's part of a grand tradition of faith shaped by suffering, a moral audacity that transcends human station. And he is a part of that tradition. So the Voting Rights Law was passed in 1965 as a result of Dr. King's activism. What most people don't know is that Dr. King's father, Daddy King, the third pastor of our church, led a voting rights campaign in Atlanta in 1935.
Wow.
So 30 years before the Voting Rights Law, 1935, Daddy King pushing for voting rights. Voting Rights Law passed in 1965. And so as I then take this walk to run for the United States Senate, I see it as part of that continuing tradition.
So speaking of continuing tradition, there was a shift after that 30-year mark. We saw Black folks kind of flocking to the Democratic Party. There are a lot of us, Reverend, who are starting to feel a little homeless. And I'm saying that because I think what we know is that there is no real place where we can have all of our agenda items and needs met. However, we've seen people with the latest version of this is Lil Wayne yesterday on Twitter posing with Donald Trump, embracing the nothing that is called the Platinum Plan. And so I'm just curious to know, like, as a Black man who is running for office as a Democrat, who knows what your tradition has been in your labor to the point you just raised, to ensure that Black people's voices and votes are heard and that they matter. How does it make you feel to see someone like Lil Wayne maybe trying to address the fact that we don't feel like all of our needs are met in one particular bucket, but the way that he went about it undermines, in a lot of ways, the very race you're running? How does it make you feel to see something like that?
Well, I don't get my politics from Lil Wayne, but
neither do I. I just wonder how it makes you feel.
There are folks who are listening and paying attention to him, certainly. I don't know, as I saw him standing there next to Donald Trump, I thought about the Central Park Five.
Ooh.
Because these are young men that I've gotten to know, at least a few of them. And we honored them last year at my church. We organized at Ebenezer last year a national conference. It was multiracial, it was multi-faith, folks who claim no faith tradition at all, focused on ending mass incarceration in America. And we honored the Central Park Five, and 3 of them were able to make it. And so I've met with these brothers, I've heard their stories, I've sat with them as a pastor to hear what they've been through. And the man that Lil Wayne stood next to yesterday took out a full-page article in the New York Times, among other things.
Yeah, three full-page ads.
And said that they needed to be executed.
Yeah.
These were teenagers at the time. They were innocent. And now that the world knows that they're innocent, Donald Trump has yet to apologize to these young men. And so if you're concerned about the prison industrial complex, and you're concerned about the ways in which this has happened over the last 40 years, and I'm certainly concerned about it, I've been working on it for years. And yeah, there was participation on both sides of the aisle, but I don't know what you get from standing next to someone who is completely unrepentant, who doubles down. I'm not sure what you get. Yeah, you're absolutely right. No place gets you everything you get, but why would you go over there? I don't understand.
Yeah. When you think about your role, W.E.B. Du Bois talked about a dual consciousness, a double consciousness. When you go to the United States Senate, you will be representing at least two constituencies, arguably many more than that. But you'll have Georgia, and then you will have Black America, because there are just not enough Black senators. When you think about what your obligations are to the community, what are some of the things that you want to ensure that you address immediately as a sitting senator?
Yes, I go to the United States Senate, and as I've moved all across Georgia, Georgians are concerned about their health care. Now, that's an example of an issue that impacts all of us, all Georgians, but for a whole range of reasons, it disproportionately impacts people of color. So when we strengthen the Affordable Care Act, rather than try to dismantle it, and extend protections, we're going to help Black people. We are disproportionately represented among the frontline workers, and because there's so many of us who have these comorbidities. I was talking to a friend earlier today about a friend who's pretty young, and the rates of hypertension, diabetes, strokes, all of these things, as we witness the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see these long-standing issues of disparities in healthcare. So I'm very focused on healthcare because I know how important and urgent it is in our community. But then we need a living wage, and we need jobs, and we need opportunities. We're sitting here in the gathering spot, the brilliant young brothers who have created this. Every time I see Brian, I just want to congratulate him. I'm so proud. I don't want to sound patronizing. He's not that much older than me, right? But he's done an amazing thing here. And so we need the Small Business Administration and all of the instruments of government to make sure that we're intentional about helping marginalized communities to live into their full possibility. And when we do that, we help the whole country.
When you were thinking about running for office, was there a tipping point moment? Was there something that made you say, I absolutely have to do this, I have to engage in other ways beyond grassroots activism and pastoring, and being just a voter, and not to marginalize the importance of a voter, but what made you want to actually run for office?
Yes, I've spent my whole life focused on service. And the work I've done at Ebenezer Church over the last 15 years, much of it has always been beyond the church doors. And so, a few months after I got to Ebenezer, I was taking Katrina evacuees back to New Orleans just so they could exercise their right to vote. I've stood up on a number of cases to deal with criminal justice reform, to deal with voting rights. And folks have been asking me to run for years. And I think when people see someone engaged, it's quite natural to say, would you think about running? I was doing the work because I thought it was important to do. I wasn't seeking any office. But I think it just feels like this is the time. Certainly Donald Trump in the last 4 years provides a very different context. I came very close to running in 2016. And as it turns out, we ended up with Donald Trump as president. And I think that it's such an urgent moment that we need everybody to use whatever platform they have, whatever gifts they have. And in this defining moment in America, I feel like who am I to say no to the opportunity to lead in this way, with people calling and asking for moral leadership at the grassroots level, ordinary folks coming up saying, Reverend, we think you'd be great, would you consider doing this? When I think about the struggles of our people, when I think about people like John Lewis, whom I knew and was his pastor, he was my mentor, who am I to say no in this defining moment in our country? Because I think that behind the public policy arguments is a more basic question about what kind of country do we want to be. The comes to these moments in American history where we have to renew and reclaim our commitment to the high ideals of the country, equal protection under the law, certain inalienable rights, as Jefferson put it, among them life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We know that that's a complicated story. He said it, but he didn't mean it in a way that other folks look up, right? But they put it on paper.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing about America. It's written in the charter documents. And the story of our movements, the abolitionist movement, the movement of women for the right to vote, the movement of people with disabilities for the American Disabilities Act, the movement of members of the LGBTQ plus community. The story of America is the effort to perfect the union. And I think this is one of those defining moments. We have a very basic question before us. Do we want to become a more fearful, hateful community where everybody's armed to the T and afraid of your neighbor, and some people at the top have way more than they could ever need, and a whole lot of people are suffering? There aren't enough gates and guns to make you feel safe in a world like that. We have to build a beloved community.
Speaking of guns, there's been a lot of conversation about a civil war, civil unrest, violence on Election Day if Trump supporters, for example, don't get the results they want. How concerned are you about that? It's a frequent conversation, if I'm honest, being very, very honest, probably too honest for y'all. Too many of my text threads with my friends, like, legitimately worried about this. And are these conversations that you're also having? And if so, how do you help to lift us out of that? I'm calling on your pastoral skills to give us some different inspiration.
Well, it's a tense moment.
Yeah.
And it's certainly a hyper-partisan moment. I mean, they made the virus a partisan issue.
Mask wearing.
Wearing a mask,
yes.
social distancing.
Yes.
You know, the mask is not red or blue. It's about, I mean, the virus is not red or blue, it's a virus. So, look, we just got to call on what Lincoln called our higher angels. We've got to lift up the best of our traditions. And at the end of the day, and I mean this, at the end of the day, we're all we've got. When I say we, I mean we in the biggest sense of the word. We should have known that we're tied in the single garment of destiny, as Dr. King put it. We should have known that I need my neighbor to be covered by health insurance, and if she's uncovered, I'm unprotected. We should have known that before the virus. But as tragic as this virus is, it's tragic in its own terms. So I don't want to minimize that at all, but it's also instructive in the sense that now we have a deadly airborne disease. My neighbor coughs, and I'm potentially in trouble because my neighbor's sick. I think if you think about it, that's a moment for insight. So I need that person to be covered. It's the right thing to do. That's the moral argument. But it's also enlightened self-interest. That when she's covered, I'm protected. So I need that person to have health care coverage. I need their children to have access to a good quality education so that they can contribute and be productive and prosperous citizens. I need for their grandmother and grandfather to be able to afford prescription drugs and to be able to retire with dignity. We are tied together. And so I think over the next 4 days into the election and afterwards, we've got to keep saying that we're all we've got, Democrat and Republican. I know we don't feel that way these days because there's so much anger, but we're all we've got. There's nowhere to go. And so, I think I would lift up the words of King, not Martin, Rodney King, who said, we're stuck here for a while, can't we all get along? And I think in this moment, we got to do it.
I don't know if we all can just get along, but I promise to try.
I don't think we have a choice, eh?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. And I think I'm deeply concerned because there are people like you who have run for office who I have deep affinity for, that I know are the right candidates, that I know won, to believe in that. And so even when I'm like, here, selfishly, y'all, I'm asking these questions because I need that final push. I believe in it a little bit. Like, I've been in these states because I believe in it. I'm holding on to the little bit that's left, but there is some hopelessness, especially because of all we experienced this year, to your earlier point.
But so let me just speak to the voting thing around voter suppression. There's no question. You're in Georgia. Voter suppression is real. But I want to say to the folks who are watching this, that's why you must show up. Now that may seem counterintuitive. What do you mean?
No, but it's right.
That's why you must show up. And for folks who say my vote doesn't count, I say to them, well, clearly it does, because they're doing a whole lot to keep you from voting. So someone has seen your power, and they're trying to keep you from exercising it. So this is the fight that people like Stacey Abrams and I have been in for years here in Georgia. We've been registering hundreds of thousands of voters. She ran for governor, as you lift up.
She won. I said it.
Sure. So she ran for governor, and she certainly was running against a man who was both her opponent and the umpire.
Yeah.
Calling balls and strikes. No question about that. His finger firmly on the scale.
Yeah.
The good news is, well, the bad news is, with his finger firmly on the scale, he squeaked by her, but barely. Barely. She lost by less than 55,000 votes, 1.4%. The good news is that since 2018, we've registered 800,000 new voters in the state. 49% of them are people of color, and 45% of them are under 30.
Wow.
So we have the coalition. We have many more times the numbers of votes that she lost by. We several times. I'm not good at math. That's what I'm saying. Instead of becoming an engineer, I'm just kidding. But
said that about law school.
but we registered 800,000 votes. So voter suppression is not something that necessarily goes away. But the answer to voter suppression is massive voter mobilization. Because as you mobilize voters, it becomes harder and harder to steal an election. The other side knows it, and that's why they're afraid. That's why Donald Trump will be here on Sunday. Donald Trump is coming to Georgia, y'all, 2 days before the election day. He's coming to so-called red Georgia.
Right.
And Georgia's very much in play, and it's in play because we've been doing the work, so let's keep doing the work through election day.
As you get to election day, what is your biggest fear, and then what is your biggest hope for election day?
Wow, my biggest fear. That we'll get too comfortable too soon. So, show up. I think that's part of the story of 2016.
Yeah.
There were a lot of folk who assumed that, of course, that can't happen. Well, it did.
Yeah.
So, my biggest fear is that we will get too comfortable too soon. My biggest hope is that come Tuesday, we are going to see the same kind of passion that we saw this summer in the wake of the tragic killing of our brother George Floyd, who was lynched in broad daylight on film. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery right here in Georgia, killed by vigilantes who arrogated to themselves the power of law. Rayshard Brooks, whom I eulogized. And in the wake of those deaths, the good news is that maybe because we're all in our houses for weeks and we couldn't turn away as so often America does, we saw a multiracial, multi-generational coalition of conscience march out into American streets and say that we can't be this, we're better than this. And I hope that come Tuesday we'll see that march didn't stop. That the folks who marched in the streets marched right onto the polls in order to change America.
My last question for you is, as we get through Election Day on November 4th, what is your hope that America turns towards? You just talked about America turning away from, as it often does.
I've been saying this for a long time, that we've got to redeem the soul of America. I think that behind the big public policy debates is a question about the spiritual health of the country. And I don't say this from a sectarian point of view, but whatever your religious tradition. I think the brokenness of our infrastructure is a reflection of the brokenness in the American soul and our politics. Like when you're the wealthiest nation in the world and you've allowed your streets to crumble the way they have and infrastructure to go down, it's like a dysfunctional family that has lost its way in some ways. And so I would like to see us invest in America again. I'd like to see us rebuild our roads, our bridges, our tunnels. I'd like to see us have better infrastructure so you and I don't lose our ID next time we do this on the road. I'd like to see us build green energy infrastructure, create green energy jobs, invest in America. I think it's the smart thing to do. In the short term, it will create jobs. Since we're having to provide relief anyway, we might as well put people to work. And I think it would position the American economy to lead in the 21st century.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Reverend Warnock. Best of luck to you.
Thank you.
Let us know if we can be helpful before Tuesday or after if necessary, but I believe you got this. Thank you so much.
All right. I'm going to agree with you.
Good.